Hello and welcome to Juliet and Lucy's Quiet Leadership Revolution, the podcast for senior and aspiring leaders who want to make their voice heard and their impact felt through thoughtful, reflective, confident leadership. I'm Juliet Corbett. I'm an executive coach and strategist, and I work one-to-one with senior leaders, guiding them to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time.
And I'm Lucy Gower. I'm a facilitator, trainer and coach, and I empower senior leaders to build their happy, confident and high-performing teams. Today we're going to talk about how to tell stories that inspire and lead. And I'm super excited about this one because I do so much work with leaders specifically around storytelling and giving them the confidence and skills to do it for themselves and with their team. Juliet, I know that you do a lot of work around storytelling with the people you coach too.
Yeah, it kind of weaves its way through, probably unnamed, weaves its way through most of the work that I do. And when you suggested this as a topic for today, I was really excited. And partly because this is going to be an evergreen episode that you can listen to at any point in the year. And this is our episode that's going to go out around Christmas time.
Happy Christmas.
So those adverts, happy Christmas, everyone. Happy Boxing Day. I think it's landing on Boxing Day. So those adverts that we've all been watching around the big set piece Christmas advertising, I think always makes me think of analysing the stories that they're telling, and which ones work and which ones don't is always kind of an interesting game to play around Christmas time in particular. But of course, this goes much, much wider, doesn't it? We talked in our last episode about the power of storytelling and why you need to be feeling really confident and empowered around telling stories for so many different things around leadership.
Yeah, stories are so important because they connect on a human to human basis. We remember stories, we share stories, and they can be really powerful as a leadership tool. And I think for me, when I started to investigate stories and kind of unlock not just why they were so powerful, but how you do it, like there was some real penny drop moments for me. And now I love training in storytelling. It's one of the training sessions that I run where you can feel it in the air, people connecting. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I first got into this idea that there's actually a kind of a step-by-step guide to how to do this when I read Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. I actually have the book next to me here. And this idea, it was new to me as I read this book, actually, this idea around the hero's journey. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. But I love the idea, and this is what we're going to explore today, that there are key ingredients to making a story work and what can go wrong if you miss out some of those key ingredients. But also, it's about innovating and playing. And so maybe there are times that you can break those rules, and that also can work really well. So then we're going to frame our conversation around that,
rules are made to be broken, surely. Keep doing the same thing. You've got to play. But I'm a big believer in know the models and the structures and the basics, and then play with that. It's almost like you've got to know the structure first before you can effectively play. Does that make play boring if I say it has to be effective? Maybe.
Maybe, but I think in a working context, probably it needs to be effective as well as fun if play is going to have a really kind of constructive part of our working life. The thing that came to mind there is that even Picasso, when you look at some of his later works, you might think, okay, this guy can't draw. You look at his early works, by gosh, this guy could draw. He's clearly got all of the foundations in place. He knows all of the rules, and he has chosen to play with those rules and break them and bend them as he wants to. And that gives him the power to have that impact, that world-leading impact that he had.
So let's learn some rules and then break them. Excellent.
Excellent. Okay, so first of all, maybe the first thing that's really useful is to list out some of the key ingredients. So what are the key ingredients we're going to need to make a good story?
Yeah, great. So I want to just give a nod to Joseph Campbell, who was an American writer and academic, who is credited with the hero's journey structure. He did a huge amount of research to what makes a good story, looking at religious texts, fables, fiction, a huge piece of academic research, trying to identify what were the bits that made a good story. And his original paper was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is a little bit overwhelming. But from that, there's a kind of hero's journey structure, which 80% of Hollywood uses because it connects people. So that's a kind of like the background there. So using Joseph Campbell's hero's journey structure, there's several things to think about when you are storytelling. The first thing, before I go into like the stage of the narrative, it's like, who's your story for? Who's your audience? Who are you telling the story to? What do you want them to feel, think, and do? How much do you know about them? That's your starting point. I think sometimes when our confidence can take a little dip, we start telling a story, and then as we're telling it, we're thinking, hang on a minute, why am I telling this? So just spend a minute or two going, right, why am I telling this? What do I want them to feel, think, and do? I'm leading a team. There's change happening. I want them to feel safe. I want them to trust me. What's the story that I tell about that? What's the truth that I can give them to help them to come with me on this change journey, for example? That's the first bit. So then it's thinking about the structure of the story. And there's something around setting the story up. Who's the central character? What's it about? Who's it about? And this is the bit where I'd say tell people enough to pique their interest, but you don't have to tell loads and loads of detail. Then a story has to have a problem. There has to be a challenge. Something happens that changes life as we know it. And often the central character doesn't want to change, doesn't take the first step. So as I'm talking, what can be really helpful is to think about what are some of your favorite stories, and thinking about, oh, do they follow this recipe or not? Most do, some might not, but it can be, if you're interested in enhancing your leadership storytelling skills, it can be helpful to kind of have like a little thought about some of the stories that inspire you, or that you know it's time to go to bed, but you just got to watch that next one because you're on the edge of your seat.
As often happens with Netflix, for me at least. Yes. Yeah, no,
Yes.
absolutely. So we've got a sense of who the audience is, and you can deconstruct that as well by looking at stories that you love. We've got a sense of who is that central character. This is the hero, I guess. And maybe we can talk in a few minutes about how people often cast the hero incorrectly. So who is the hero in the story that you're watching? What is the problem that they're facing? What's the challenge? And maybe they're putting it off. Maybe they're not taking that step to solve the problem. And then what comes next?
Yeah, because they often do. We know that human beings, we don't really like change. We often might resist change. Then in Campbell's model, there's often some sort of mentor or guide that helps that central character work through some of their problems or challenges. It's not necessarily an obvious character. It might come from unusual places, but there's something really important about that struggle, that journey, the challenges and overcoming them, which for human beings, the research shows that if we've set the scene well and we care about what happens when there's a problem presented, we get a influx of cortisol, the stress hormone, which in this context means that we lean in. We want to know what happens. And as human beings, we kind of want to be part of the solution as well. There's a researcher called Paul Zak, and we'll put some of his research in the show notes, that has done work around human physiology when they're engaging with different types of story and the change that happens to us. And this piece around cortisol, when we hear about a problem and we lean in, and when we can be part of the solution, we get an influx of oxytocin, which gets called the love drug. But it's all about human connection. And I think I've said human connection about 10 times in the last 10 minutes, perhaps. So it's like it's really, really important. So it's kind of no surprise that our physiology changes when we engage in story, and our changes are around human connection.
Yeah.
So problem and challenge, and then figuring out what the solution is and what the end result is, that bit, and then finally piece. And I think in a lot of the leadership stories that we're talking about, it's not about the outcome, but it's what's the impact. So, certainly, Juliet, for the work that you do around strategy, there's a difference between one ending and another ending if everybody in the organization gets involved. But that's not the end of the story. The end is what's the impact, the change that makes to your customer, your end user, whoever that audience is that's engaging in the story?
So I think this structure explains why all those things that we talked about in our last episode was true. So you're creating a narrative by which you're influencing people's commitment, influencing people's behavior, getting people to feel connection, and that it all then creates a picture of the future around the impact that you have, and preferably an impact that people care about, because that's how you're creating behavior based on that connection they have to the story.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know me, Lucy, I envisage cake at a moment's notice. So I'm envisaging that we're making a cake and that we're putting these ingredients in. So we've got the key ingredients we've got going into this story cake that we're making is knowing our audience and knowing what we want them to feel, think, and do.
Yeah.
The central character, often called the hero, the problem they face. Oh,
yeah.
yes, tell me more.
The central character isn't necessarily the hero in your story.
Okay.
I'm gonna hold you there and we'll come back to it.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Because as I said before, they're often miscast as well. The problem that central character faces, potentially the involvement of a mentor or guide, the solution they come to, and then finally the impact of the future, the world as it looks as a result of the fact that they found that solution.
Yeah.
And the one that always comes to me, I'm not merely a Star Wars aficionado. I'm kind of becoming increasingly so because my kids are interested in watching it. But that's one of the classics, isn't it? That you think about Luke Skywalker and meeting Yoda and the problem that they face, and then the solution and the picture changes.
So it'll be no surprise that George Lucas was a massive fan of Joseph Campbell.
That doesn't surprise me at all. So tell me a little bit more about my misplaced putting in the same category the main character and the hero. Why is it that your main character isn't always the hero?
So again, depending a little bit on the story, but your hero, in the context that we're talking about around leadership, the hero is often the person that your audience that you're telling the story to. So for example, you are leading change, you have I'm going to use a CRM manager example again. So you're leading change, there's a change process happening, and you might tell the story of somebody that is struggling with the change. The hero might be the person in your team that helps that person with that struggle. So the hero might be the central character, but more often than not, the hero is the person that you're telling the story to, and the thing that they do makes them the hero within the story.
Okay. So maybe we need to put the word hero to one side. Maybe that's too confusing because in different scenarios it'll be a different element of the story. So if you've got that central character, is it always the central character who's the one that you want to influence around the behavior change or the action that's taken?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. If we go back to the cake with all of the ingredients, the person whose story that you are telling, again, it comes back to your audience. The reason that you're telling that story in the first place, what you want your audience to feel, think, and do. Often in a leadership story, you want your audience to do something, to make a change, to get on board with a new concept, to help others move forward in a particular way. So hero's journey might be a little bit confusing. So let's go back to a fundraising story. You're telling the story about Susan, who hasn't got anywhere to live, and you're telling the story about Susan, and because the donor does something, Susan's outcome is better. So the donor is the hero in the story.
Yes, I see. Okay.
And it's that you're translating into, so, let's tell you a leadership story about Dave, the CRM manager, who's really struggling. He needs everyone in the team to get on board with this. You, as everyone in the team, getting on board with Dave, you become the heroes in the story. It's that.
Okay. I see. So that's why I'm backtracking now to really understanding why, if we don't have that understanding of the audience before we start creating the story, then we're definitely missing a key ingredient, and the cake's going to be pretty flat as a pancake and not rise, because it's understanding then who you're casting into these different roles. And one of the things that sometimes happens is that the leader feels that they need to be the central character or they need to be the hero, but actually often that's not the case, isn't it?
Exactly. And often the leader could be the mentor or the coach, because as a leader, you are helping others to step up to their own leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't feel you need to be the central character or the hero in the story. The
Mm-hmm.
beauty of storytelling is that it's about connection and engaging with other people in that narrative.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the ways to think about it as well is the way in which some of these stories that we're using as examples would be internal leadership of a team. When we're translating that into leadership around stakeholders and thinking about clients or customers, thinking about other stakeholders who take action, such as donors, for example, actually there it's also really important to potentially the mentor might be the organization as well
Yes.
as well.
Yes, absolutely. So you make a product that helps people.
Mm-hmm.
You've made this product for 50 years. You're the best at it. You're really good. You can provide it at a really good cost. It's really high quality. You know what you're doing here. Look, here we go. Let me guide you to buy this
Yeah,
product because it's going to have a better outcome for you as a customer.
yeah, yeah. So thinking about in a retail setting, I mean, the way that often it's easiest to think about marketing and advertising in a kind of a retail
Yeah.
high street setting. So if we think about some of those classic adverts that we're seeing on the TV at the moment,
Yeah.
for example, the way that I mean, I was just watching the John Lewis example, that their advert actually has the customer come into the store and then they create a story, a fantastical kind of fantasy story around how they help that customer to find the right product to buy as a gift. But it's actually the store which is acting as the mentor in triggering the memories in this particular case,
Yes.
which help that customer to identify.
Yes. So it's a delicate shift in dynamic, not of like buy our stuff, we're really good, to our stuff can help you to have the outcomes that you want,
Yes.
like an easier lifestyle. Like I get my car cleaned at the garage that I buy my car from. They're really good at cleaning my car, much better than I am. It means that in the time that I am not cleaning my own car, I'm walking the dog and going and getting a coffee and having a really nice time. They're still offering me a product and they're doing a lot to keep good engagement and a great customer service journey. But the story is that come to us, we're really great, we can help you and you can have a better outcome, and the impact for your day is that you are not covered in soap suds and really cold, and that you've had a lovely coffee and a relaxing walk with your dog.
Yeah.
It's a subtle shift of
Yeah,
mindset.
it is. But it makes a big difference to the way that someone connects with the story. And
Yes.
if that story had been we're the best garage, full
Yeah.
stop, it's not going to have the same emotional connection as I get time to go spend
Exactly.
on myself. I get time to go and have a coffee.
Exactly.
I get time to have a walk with the dog, and I get to feel proud and not embarrassed when people see my car. It's a feeling that I know well,
Juliet
Lucy.
has seen my car, so I'm not going to call you on that. Yeah, it's how it makes your audience feel.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Coming again back to the importance of knowing the audience and what you want them to feel, think, and do as a result of hearing
Yeah.
your story. So,
Yeah.
so what goes wrong when we try to tell these stories? So the first thing that can get in the way is going to be missing a key ingredient or casting the wrong person in different elements of the
Yeah.
story. What else can go wrong?
Yeah, great question. I think the things that I see going wrong is because we know so much about the stories that we tell, we get something that I call the curse of knowledge, where we try and tell too much background information up front and we lose people. Just give people enough information to make them care, and no more than that. It's back to what is it that you need to tell them to make them care, not all the things that you want to tell them, which can often be two different things.
I think that's really important, that it's not about, if you're writing a novel, it might make sense to spend a fair amount of time creating a picture in the reader's mind
Yeah.
of the context in which this
Yeah.
novel is then going to unfold. that's not what we're doing. We're telling a fairly brief, compact, impactful story. And so the amount of context they need is fairly limited, and it needs to be focused in on generating emotional connection to the
Yeah.
to the characters.
And a good kind of rule of thumb, enough to make them care. And how do you know if people care? You practice
Yes.
telling your story, and you see if the audience that you're telling it to are engaged, and they care enough
Yeah.
to know what happens next.
Which actually comes back to Picasso. Picasso, you practiced an enormous amount. I mean, I haven't specifically seen his sketchbooks, but I've seen original sketchbooks from many artists, and the amount of times they practice and they get it wrong. And they'll practice over and over and over again until they've
Yeah.
got it right. This is one of those skills where you practice your
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I think the other thing that is where stories go wrong or are not as
Mm-hmm.
impactful as they could be is when we try and paint too big a picture. See
I
what I did there?
did,
That little
yeah, very
Picasso,
nice.
like. um. So sometimes we want to show the scale of something, or the enormity of something, and we might talk about things in a way that our brains can't handle it. So the story of one person, boiling it down to a very specific story of one, rather than talk about hundreds of thousands of
Mm-hmm.
people or customers, or paint a problem too big. Our brains can't manage it. So, if you see analogies like, I was at the garden centre recently, and the lawn feed has little pictures of cars on the front to show how many cars you can cover in that particular box. That's a really good example of not going, it's 25 square meters, because I've got to know how many I have
Yeah,
no idea how much that is, but I know how many
yeah,
cars
the area would
it
cover, yeah.
takes. So you might want to talk about big numbers within your storytelling. Don't boil it down to the smallest granular thing that you can, because our brains can handle that. Our brains can't handle really big numbers, and what we tend to do is
Yeah.
to ignore
So
them.
telling the story at an individual level. So it's human centered because of the emotion, but
Yes,
it's actually also human centered as in human and individual person centered. And then
yeah,
if you want to give an image of
exactly,
scale, you
exactly,
can say, this story is then repeated thousands of times across the year, or whatever it might be, so
yeah,
that you can give a
yeah,
sense of scale,
yeah,
but only once you've anchored somebody into the impact on the individual that they care about. Yeah. Okay.
exactly, yeah, absolutely. And then I think the other thing that I see is where stories are not as impactful as they could be is that we hold back on talking about the problem, and we jump to solutions really quickly. So again, your audience and what you want them to feel, think, and do is paramount. And within that, once you've decided that, don't hold back on talking about the problem. Remember, when we hear a problem, we want to help people, we lean in. Um, and sometimes it can feel there can be a tension there, because you might not want to talk about problems within your organization. But if you're not talking about what the problem is for your organization, for your customers, for your teams, you're not giving anybody the opportunity to be a hero and come up with a
Yeah.
solution. Hero in the
Yes.
loosest sense. But if you're not giving somebody a problem that they can be part of helping you solve, you're losing engagement with
Yeah,
that
which is,
story.
again, sorry, I always want to feed this back into strategy, but is exactly where
Yeah,
one
yeah,
of the biggest
yeah, yeah,
problems, or where strategy can really fall flat, is where you don't actually address the main problem, and you're so busy fluffing the pillows around the edge that you fail to notice that the sofa on which you're fluffing them is, it's only got two legs and about to fall over and needs to really be refurbished completely. So this idea that actually it's about
exactly.
having the psychological safety and the comfort levels within the team to talk about problems, and to do that honestly and
Yeah,
openly. Sometimes there are things that are confidential, potentially considering mergers and acquisitions, so on. This needs to be adapted, but it's really important that you have that psychological safety to talk about the problems in order to then craft the story, craft the solution together. And I think probably that's one of the few places in this kind of mini series around storytelling where we can differentiate between internal and external. I think often the same rules apply if you're doing internal storytelling to your team or external storytelling to your customers. But obviously, when you're talking about problems in the internal sense, you're talking about your organizational problems. In the external sense, you're talking about the problems faced by the customers, by the central characters that you're crafting the story, and therefore the problems that you solve with the products and services that your organization provides to those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that those are the kind of core ingredients. And then often people say, but I once saw this film that the end was at the beginning, and then something else new happened and it didn't follow this at all. And I kind of did some digging into this. And my view is that those are the ingredients. Which order you put them in the cake. Once you've baked your cake, once you baked your first cake and you've practiced and you've got a really good cake, then play. But my belief is that if you've got all of those ingredients, that is good storytelling.
Yeah.
Play with those ingredients and your different audiences and build your confidence to do it. But start with the linear structure, if you like, and then mess with it.
So we're now talking about a cake which I can stick all the ingredients into one food processor, mix it all together. It doesn't matter which order I put the ingredients into the food processor. I just mix it all together. Okay, so with the risk of becoming very hungry because I'm talking about cake, what are the rules can we break? So if one of the rules we can break is the order, so we've got our key ingredients and maybe we can play with the order, create a hook at the beginning of the story by talking about this amazing future. Imagine a future where, describe it, and then you say, but actually this is the problem we're currently facing, for example. What are the other rules that we might invite people to play around with?
Gosh, that's such a good question, because I think order, like I think audience, feel, think, and do. I don't think you mess with that. You still need to be really clear on what success looks like and why you're telling a story. I think you can play around with who's the hero, who's the mentor, and what that looks like. I think that you can play around with scale and how you present that. And I think that but I don't think you can play around with with the problem. I think that without a problem, you don't have a story. You've maybe got a case study or a series of words. But I'm prepared to be challenged on that. If you've got examples of, like, I took your story structure and I threw it out and I didn't bake a cake or do anything, and look, it's really worked. Here's the impact and results.
Yeah,
I'd love to know. Please tell me.
An invitation to everybody to let us know what we've missed. Yes, and even on that problem, I reckon there's some play around how you make people feel emotionally connected to it. The examples that you might be able to give, which helped it to root the problem into people's lived experience potentially.
Yeah. You've just reminded me, there's one thing that I think is catastrophic if it goes wrong, is if you're not telling your stories with integrity. We talked about this in the last one. It's not about making up stories, and it's not about manipulating people. It's about telling the truth well with the integrity and intent of making a better future. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about storytelling, and telling stories that are not for the greater good personally doesn't sit well.
We talked last episode about the importance of having the values and the ethical framework in which this operates, and that's almost like the silent truth behind all of our episodes, is that you've got that set of values that are robust and that ethical framework in which you're working. But I think this is probably one of the areas where, because it is such a powerful tool, there is a heightened risk that you might head this off in the wrong direction, and that you don't want, for example, to be generating your audience to take behaviors through a feeling of fear. Generally speaking, that's not what you want at any point. No. So trying to avoid some of the strongest negative emotions, actually not avoid, but trying to be careful that you're not relying on only the strongest negative emotions in order to create behavior. So you might touch on the strongest negative emotions around fear, anxiety, etc., but that then is also combined with the elements of positive hope and the difference that individuals can make, for example. I think that's really important.
I suppose I suppose it's ethics around your storytelling and the integrity of it might be your own stories that you're telling. Sometimes you're telling someone else's story, and the ethics of that, and that you have a great power in sharing somebody else's story in whatever context, and that you do that ethically and with integrity.
With permission, exactly. So the permission around confidentiality and can't even say it. Anonymity is really important. So it might be appropriate to fully anonymize a story and then tell it, when it definitely wouldn't be appropriate to name the individual potentially within that story. But I would say for any of these questions, if this is something that you're thinking about, I would say it's always a good idea to talk to somebody. And that can be a peer, it can be someone who's more experienced within your organization, or an external coach. It doesn't matter who it is, but somebody that you can robustly talk it through. I think that actually when it comes to ethics, it's one of those where just a thought process normally isn't robust enough. Saying it out loud with someone who's going to be able to challenge that is really important. Yeah. So as we wrap up our episode, and this is our second of two on storytelling, what are the key things that you'd like people to take away?
I think remembering that storytelling is best communication tool in your toolkit. I think take the process that we've talked about, practice it, get confidence, play with it, experiment, enjoy, but don't lose sight of the integrity of the stories that you're telling. That's so important. What about you,
basically
Juliet?
the same. The sense that this is a innate skill and a skill that you can practice, and that the easiest way to practice is to follow the framework we've talked about today. I would recommend having a look at that Donald Miller book that we talked about earlier, Building a Story Brand, because although that's specifically around marketing, it actually is particularly easy to read and impactful if that's an area you want to expand your knowledge on.
And the other book that I'd recommend is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath on storytelling.
Fantastic. Excellent. I've read some of their other books, not that one. So that's my action as we come to the end of this episode, is to go and get that book. It sounds excellent. So how can you help people with storytelling, Lucy?
I run training for teams in storytelling. I help leaders with their own storytelling narrative. Get in touch at lucy@lucidity.org.uk if you'd like to talk about storytelling for your team. How about you, Juliet?
Fantastic. Well, I work with leaders one-to-one to understand their own stories and their own kind of back career kind of narrative, and also to help them tell stories within their teams that are going to get kind of behavior change and culture change really instilled in a much more fun kind of way. So if you want to talk about one-to-one executive coaching, you can contact me at juliet@consultjuliet.co.uk. Right then, well, if you are listening around Christmas time, I'm going to do a final Merry Christmas, but probably you're listening in the height of summer, so that will be completely irrelevant, and that's fine too. And we're really, really pleased that you've spent this time with us. So thank you for spending this podcast episode with us. Don't forget that if you want to make your voice heard and your impact felt, you need to give yourself the space to think, the courage to lead, and the confidence to adapt. I'm Juliet Corbett, an executive coach and strategist working one-to-one with senior leaders.
I'm Lucy Gower, a facilitator, trainer and coach helping senior leaders develop high-performing teams. Join us next time for the Quiet Leadership Revolution.